Good morning, everybody, and welcome to ASPI. We are here today to effectively launch a publication that we're particularly proud of, and that we hope that you'll be interested to explore with us. It's called AUKUS Pillar 2 Critical Pathways. It was launched on the 9th of May and has enjoyed a bit of support and a lot of interest. There are a number of strategist pieces from our ASPI blog that support this piece that we ran around that 9th of May period. There's a podcast with one of the co-authors, QinetiQ, on the system if you want to dig into it a little bit more as well. But today we really wanted to get into the key findings and provide another opportunity to engage industry actors and other interested players in what we found, why we did this, and the importance of the body of work. May I first start, before we really kick into things though, just in an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet, which are wide and various today for this webinar. And I do pay my respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging. Now, we have today three wonderful guests. We have co-author of the report, Roland Stevens. Roland is with the State Government Investment and Borrowing Authorities, General Manager there of Government and Client Relations. But importantly, Roland, in a previous life, was the head of Defence and Trade at Austrade, a position I followed him into and had a bit of time with, and that's where we both have a lot of contact with defence and space industry. Joining us for the panel conversation a little bit later after we've heard from Roland, we have Tracey, who is International Director at Saronic, and he can tell you a little bit more about that company when we throw to him. And we also have the Chief Executive for Australia for QinetiQ. We have Stewart. So what we've got is a co-author, and Roland will provide something of an overview of the report. And then we're going to move to a panel conversation. So please start thinking as we go through the start of this of any questions that you want to ask, either about the report or about AUKUS Pillar 2. And we're going to canvass, again, a range of perspectives. We've got Matthew representing a startup, a high-tech endeavour, and we've got Gary, of course, with a very complex multinational, very well-established defence industry player. All I want to say before I throw to Roland is that the reason that we did this report and we enjoyed wonderful support from Raytheon and Leidos as contributors, so I acknowledge those partners and thank them for their support. We couldn't have done it without them. We felt that there was the conversation on AUKUS Pillar 2 was getting stuck. It was getting stuck on barriers, particularly the ITAR conversation, and we wanted to move it forward. We wanted to illuminate practical pathways to success. We wanted to understand, stepping into the shoes of industry, what the experiences were, bust a few myths that we thought were out there, and really go after showing what success could look like and what we needed to do to move forward. No further needed from me. I'm going to hand over now to Roland, and he can tell you exactly how he went about this research and the key findings. Roland.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you for the introduction. While I have everyone's attention at the beginning, I'll do some thank yous of my own. Firstly to George, who can't be here, but really who did a lot of the heavy lifting, and to the peer reviewers and ASPI staffing, especially you, Beck. And I'll also acknowledge Raytheon and Leidos and SIPAC, Hypersonics and Mallory, and all the 170 organisations that contributed to the report. So there's been a lot of reports on AUKUS, a lot on Pillar 1, some on Pillar 2. So there's that first question, what more can be said? What can we contribute? And we didn't answer that threshold question in isolation. We went out to defence industry participants, both in the public and private sector. And the feedback we received made it clear that there is more to say, and in particular that those voices need to be heard. So this report serves that function, and the key the key to the insight it offers is through that consultative report methodology. And the methodology was one of engagements. We posed questions on AUKUS Pillar 2 enablers and barriers to those 170 organisations, SMEs, primes in Australia, officers in the Department of Defence that interact with them, and we used those answers to form conclusions and recommendations. So the approach was very inductive. And it culminates in those case studies, those 3 case studies that sit in the body of the report, which speaks to that inductive voice of industry approach. The objectives of the work were very simple. So the first was to understand how businesses navigate export and technology sharing systems across AUKUS partner countries. The second was to understand pain points. I mean, pain points and also successes, right? When navigating the system. And then out of that was to offer concrete proposals for reform. So all of that arises from the genuine voice of industry. And that voice speaks to industry perceptions, and perceptions drive behaviour. So the one, I guess, observation around the utility of the report I would make is that it is therefore valuable whether or not one agrees with all of the conclusions or the recommendations or the observations. This is an aggregation of understanding out there within defence industry. Now, on the recommendations, there are 12 in all, which I won't go through them sequentially, but I'll describe them in thematic clusters. The first thematic cluster, and you'd expect this from someone who works in the financial services sector, is that money matters. Certainly money from the government, but also from investors, most of whom for defence purposes are sector agnostic and have an open choice on where they put their capital. So that capital is needed by firms to feed their expansion into AUKUS Pillar 2 opportunities. And there's no shortage of capital across all industries for proponents with a compelling investment case. But in the defence sector, more than any other sector, that investment case is a function of government action. So government, the regulator, government, the buyer, and government, the potential co-investor. And if government plays a constructive role in these 3 domains, capital will flow, which in this case is your financing to go into those AUKUS Pillar 2 opportunities. It's probably worth noting at this juncture just the scale gap between investment between Australia and its largest AUKUS partner in the US. So if you use the DST budget as a proxy, it's growing in round numbers around $400 million US. And then you've got the US spend, which is around 100 billion. So 24 times that. And then a larger percentage of their procurement budget going into R&D than ours. Now, they've got the opportunity to do that because they've got fiscal leverage. They're just spending a lot more. But even accounting for that, the gulf is large, and that creates challenges for AUKUS Pillar 2. You're trying to establish a deep technology partnership between very lopsided partners, if I can put it that way. So how and where investment is delivered also matters. And really the objective should be to attract co-investment from the private sector, which eases the public burden and brings other benefits that private investors and especially financial investors can provide. So on top of that, before you even get to that, more investment is needed in the offices tasked with regulating and supporting businesses seeking partnerships and opportunities under the AUKUS Pillar 2 banner. So there are 4 recs that really speak to that theme. And the first was more resourcing for defence export controls, DISP and other organisations that are those agents of competitive advantage in the AUKUS world. They need the commercial and security skills to play their role, and that requires investment. And you could extend that to other parts of government that provide services into businesses, could be Austrade, parts of Department of Industry and others. The next related recommendation is that we must prepare our industry to compete and confront the heft and complexity and opacity of the US defence acquisition environment. Each of these recommendations really builds on the last. The third is we need to support industry with the required skill set. So there's some services can be provided by government, some they'll need to provide to themselves or solicit from the private sector. And we're thinking here about skills in export control, regulatory compliance, industrial security, and cross-border technical certification. These don't exist in the amount that they need to, and acquiring them will take money. And the last one in the money matters theme really is to more government provision of investment directly and unlocking expansion capital from the private sector required to scale up to supply the US and UK markets. And I sort of started with that, right? So that's government, the regulator, government, the purchaser, and government, the co-investor. The second theme is around incentives and balancing risk, and this was a big part of the report. The importance of how regulations are implemented and the fact that that is as important as the elegance of a regulation on the page. So the report calls for attention to be paid to incentives driving officials as they weigh the balance of risks managed through export control and other regulations. Maybe just a word on the risks and that balance. So the macro risk is that over-regulation or the overzealous application of regulation throws up barriers to cooperation amongst the AUKUS partners, which over time crimps your capability. Now, if that were all, you could limit regulations and innovate swiftly like you do in other sectors. But of course, information security is incredibly important and key. But the macro risk of capability lost to aggressive regulatory settings really plays out over a long period through an aggregation of decisions, whereas information security risk can also play out that way, but can also present as discrete risks, traceable to smaller numbers of decisions. So there's a strong incentive to manage those discrete risks very strongly, and often in ways that might compromise the management of the macro risk. Our engagement with industry participants surfaced examples of this in defence export control regulations, and in information security. I mean, the classic example, which is well known, is overclassification of materials in the US, which is a well-known problem. So the report addresses this by noting that regulatory reform must be matched with organisational reform, so regulators have balanced incentives to drive the balanced management of these competing risks. And to dwell on that for a moment, one insight from speaking to industry is that regulators fall differently on different types of technology proponents or firms. So a decision that is an irritant or a source of competitive advantage to one proponent could at the other extreme be financially useful to another. So the relative weight of that macro risk of losing capability shifts depending on the proponent. We are asking a lot of regulators here. We're asking a lot, which is why the first call is for them to be fully resourced. And regulatory reform driven by AUKUS Pillar 2 allows us to revisit these questions and really find ways to incentivise regulators and industry to experiment and to make and learn from their mistakes. So there are two recs here. One is around private and public sector organisational incentives, which I've spoken to, and the other is on don't focus on past winners or declare success over easy wins. And what we mean here is that the real win here is a system that encourages new or small entrants into AUKUS Pillar 2 opportunities. And that's especially important for Australia, given the preponderance of small operators we have relative to the US or the UK. Mm-hmm. The third theme is the use of regulatory reform for AUKUS Pillar 2 as a lever for competitive advantage. A good risk management system, which is what these regulations and technology standards offer, can be a source of competitive advantage. And coming back to AUKUS Pillar 2, we can really embrace this as an opportunity in the relevant technology areas. And I'll jump straight to the recs in this theme because they are, I think, self-explanatory. So the first is to have regulatory regimes that are flexible by design. And we recommend, in particular, expert-led governing bodies that can manage ambiguity and surprise, because there'll be a lot of both. The second is to simplify regulations and drive synchronicity, which is really about maximising the upside, which synchronicity will bring with our AUKUS partners, while you're separately minimising or mitigating downsides. And you might do that through the application of resources like we talked about earlier. The third is to align security and data sharing standards with AUKUS partners, especially where they have better security solutions. And we cite some examples, or an example in there, though our call is for all the systems to be reconsidered as enablers of collaboration. Next is to understand the impact of changing regulations on supply chain strategies and to strive to create opportunities through this. So the rollback of the impact of ITARs is the best example. And this came through really strongly in our conversations with SIPAC. The last one in this area is to align tech standards with the United States. Now, this is an interesting one because this can offer competitive advantage to Australia across all applications and industries that develop AUKUS Pillar 2 technologies. So this is actually an advantage beyond defence as well. And we cite New Zealand's approach to US regulations and standards for space launch as an example. And our engagement with hypersonics really made that point clear to us. But it's critical we capture that upside because there will be inevitable downsides as we harmonise. And we acknowledge these in the report. The bulk of our industry are smaller operators. They are, on average, compared to our partners, less capable in navigating complex international defence regulatory environments, and they risk being left behind. They need to invest, and they need help investing in greater compliance capabilities around stricter export control rules. And there are some businesses operating in technology areas where US dominance is not the norm. And they will confront barriers, new barriers to working with third-party countries, possibly limiting their commercial opportunity set. And this came through in the Mallory case study around EW. So really, some businesses will be unambiguously hurt, and we've got to find ways to produce an upside to mitigate or outweigh those costs. The last theme is that system flex is critical. There's a balance in the report which reflects an underlying balance in the objectives of good export and technology controls regulations. On the one hand, you've got dual-use technology and all the investment there. It's playing a great role in capability development purely based on the scale of investment coming from outside of defence that influences technology development in that area. Now, if we relied on that alone for an advantage, as I said before, we could seek to collectively out-innovate the adversary, and we could have less regard for information security. But we acknowledge in the report that these commercially available capabilities, we're calling them table stakes in a great power competition. And we, Australia, lag in access to classified sources of technical knowledge. Now, AUKUS Pillar 2 reforms can address that through better regulation and infrastructure for sharing sensitive information. The question is, how do you do that in a way that minimises or doesn't crimp innovation by over-regulating less sensitive technologies or applications? So there's one recommendation here, which is looking at a differentiated approach to regulating dual-use technology, as they've got in the US. Now, to be fair, we received some feedback from Defence, noting that they do have a framework for differentiation and they take a risk-based approach that doesn't treat goods in the same way, even if you're looking at a single list. To which I would say, at a minimum, The fact the issue came up in our engagements with the industry indicates there's work to do in communicating how that works. Secondly, a risk-based approach off a single list makes the incentives bearing on ground level decision makers all the more important, because it creates a potentially ambiguous position. And thirdly, as the regulatory regime shifts to accommodate AUKUS Pillar 2, Defence should be prepared to shift direction quickly to meet the changing environment, or if new regulations are dampening collaboration or innovation. So flexibility is the key, and an explicit separate treatment of different classes of capability should at least be considered.
Yeah.
I'll close out now and conclude by saying I've focused a lot on areas of challenge, which is where interest lies, but there was a great generosity of spirit we encountered when we engaged with industry and folks in the offices who serve them. Everyone wants AUKUS Pillar 2 to work and for barriers to cooperation to be minimised, and everyone was very generous with their perspectives. The question now is, how do we get it done? And the report is addressed to that. Thank you.
Roland, that was a superb overview. Thank you. Particularly like the way that you used the themes to elucidate a lot of what we heard, and particularly the reminder that whether or not you agree with everything that is represented here, this is a genuine reflection of perception and belief within industry and experience, and you can't just dismiss that there is something there to address. Quite nicely, and not entirely by accident, we've got the AUKUS countries represented. Matthew's company is US based. QinetiQ is, of course, originating in and from the UK system. But Matthew, I might ask you to go first. How much of what Roland's sort of spoken about there in terms of the findings resonates with you? What's your response, and particularly, again, focusing on the positives and the art of the possible, what are some opportunities that you see that are really important for us to pick up on and take forward with AUKUS Pillar 2? You're having some issues with unmuting? I'll give you a minute. We'll go instead to Gary, and I'll ask the same question. Can you please first situate QinetiQ for us? Well, what is QinetiQ as a company, and how is it working and thinking about AUKUS Pillar 2, and perhaps where do you see the greatest opportunities for Australia, but also from that UK perspective?
Sure. So QinetiQ was born out of the commercialisation of about a third of the UK Defence's research laboratories and all of its test and evaluation ranges and test capabilities. So we've got 25 years of understanding how to translate from a military and bureaucratic background into industry. We took a strategy about 12 months before AUKUS came into being to focus on the 3 AUKUS countries as our home markets. Mm-hmm. So we've got a strong contribution and strong history in the UK naturally, in defence, in intelligence, in those agencies, research, test and trials. In the United States, very heavy in mission cyber, advanced cyber, but also with particularly with robotics and autonomy. And then Australia is a little bit of a misnomer. I've got a very large footprint here in Australia doing a lot of research and development, test and evaluation, embedded with Defence Science and Technology Group and with Defence. And I've also got responsibility for QinetiQ's reach into Canada, Germany, and through that into NATO, the Quad and the Five Eyes. Yeah. And so we naturally perform a role of translating defence need and mission, and how we then translate that into something which is actionable by an industrial and academic teaming and pairing, and providing a conduit, particularly out of a lot of lessons we've done in the UK, for how do you provide an environment where those smaller tier 2, tier 3 companies that maybe don't have the resource or the capital or the capacity to operate within a secure environment to satisfy all the regulatory requirements. This is all pre-AUKUS, and yet enable them to make a difference and respond to those customer and defence challenges. And we've seen that really accelerate with the advent of what's happened in the Ukraine 2 years ago, in the Middle East at the end of last year with Israel, and the pace and the need for bringing disruptive technology and innovation into existing platforms and systems, whilst also progressing that longer term defence research, is a really challenging environment to manage. AUKUS Pillar 2 and the regulatory environments that we're seeing change and harmonise at the moment is really necessary in order to facilitate that exchange of ideas. And where we see some of the real early opportunities is it enables the 3 AUKUS nations to take advantage of and leverage the investments that one of the countries has made. So a good example is the Dragonfire high energy laser work that QinetiQ, MBDA, Leonardo have been doing with the UK ministry over the last years went to trial. In January this year. You can see the results of that. Got tested at our ranges in Scotland. And on the basis of that proof of concept and the demonstration of that advanced technology in practice, the UK government is now pulling that through. Last year, we partnered with Defence Science and Technology Group here in Australia to provide them with access to some of those underpinning technologies and research from the UK. And that was to accelerate their ability to do the Australian-based laser research. And we encountered a lot of bureaucratic and export control hurdles and barriers that we see things like the harmonisation of those defence export controls will simplify and mitigate. So we feel we've been a bit of a pipe cleaner, and some of the other companies that you've cited here as case studies have that experience. So we see there's real potential and benefit for doing that, and happy to talk more about that, but also some of the points that Roland made around how we commercialise that. But I'm fundamentally optimistic about what's ahead of us.
Great.
We have some big responsibilities and challenges that we've got to manage together.
Yeah, excellent. Matthew, I think we've got you working so that we can hear you now. Can I get you to talk a little bit about Saronic, where you fit within the AUKUS ecosystem, and what you hear in terms of that report and that experience, where we need to focus effort? Does that resonate for you?
It does, and I might provide a very brief introduction and then share some perspectives from the startup field. I've recently joined Saronic Technologies, who is a US company based in Austin, Texas. And for the last year and a half, we've been building autonomous surface vessels, 6 foot, 14 foot, so smaller craft. And anyone following the space may have seen the work that we did with Anduril in the recent US Navy Integrated Battle Problem 24.1. It's one of the first public demonstrations of our work. But we are producing small vessels, rapidly manufactured for use in the US and the Allies. We've been around for about a year and a half and have since raised about 100 million Australian dollars. So we are a startup, but we are a well-funded startup funded by venture capital. And that I'm going to dovetail into that in a little bit about the startup perspective. Secondly, would commend Roland on the report, and I just want to touch on a few things which I think really spoke to us. Firstly, around the intent of AUKUS, I think Roland really outlined quite elegantly the intent of AUKUS as providing similar integrated, harmonized capabilities across the 3 countries in joint concert of supply chain and effect. And I wanted to draw a quick comparison between that and where this has worked elsewhere, but also highlight a very big distinction. So if you look at the Five Eyes has been a very successful intelligence sharing arrangement. But if you look at the nature of their work, it's sharing data, largely speaking, sharing data. When you need to bend metal and move things that need to fly and float or sit on land, it's actually a lot more complex. And I think that outlines and is sort of the basis of some of the challenges that the report very nicely points out. Then I think the thing that spoke to me next is if you look at the Pillar 2 capabilities are inherently complex and inherently expensive. And I think when we look at drawing upon a defense industrial base and more broadly an industrial base generally to satisfy those capabilities, that for me brings out a few themes. Given that these things are expensive and they're complex, and you combine that with the size of the Australian market, which is inherently small, you then have to think about what are the conditions for business to actually operate successfully in this market, and not just necessarily primes, but SMEs and startups. And then I think that raises three key points. The first is that you, as an Australian company, you need to reach global markets because our market is not necessarily big enough along those Pillar 2 capabilities for an Australian company to be commercially successful. The second is you need to attract.
Matthew, we've lost your sound again. Just then.
How about that? Have you got me now?
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
The second point is you need to attract risk capital. Given that these things are expensive, we can't expect the Australian government to fund R&D for these capabilities for every potential supplier. So you need to attract capital from defence-focused VCs like Salus or Main Sequence, or ideally increasingly from the superannuation funds as well, but that's a separate discussion. And then I also think, given the size, complexity, and nature of the Tier 2 capabilities, we need to start thinking about disaggregating people and product.
Yeah.
So if there are suppliers across AUKUS, whether they are Australian, UK, or American, you may have a product supplied by one, but services supplied by others. These things, these capabilities are hard to move, but the people who understand how to use them are even harder. So when we think about sharing capabilities, we should think not only about how do you move these things across countries, how do you have an Australian supplier support the UK and the US, but then how do you have local services support that capability once it has been moved? Because I think the report also talks about the necessity of like harmonizing information standards, but also the creation of landing pads, and how hard it is for like Australian companies to enter the US market, let alone navigate procurement. And so I might pause there, but maybe with the three things which I think the report best draws out of, which are essential here. The first is around measurement. Roland and George make the really good point around you have to measure these things at the contracting level to see if they're actually being successful. Integration between defence and industry is crucial, and there's a lot more we could do there. And then finally, harmonisation. How do you share data? How do you allow classifications to be allow that experience to actually move fluidly through the system?
Very nice. Thank you very much for that perspective as well, and a nice rounding out. We do want to go to our audience for questions and give you a chance to talk to all three of our experts here. One thing that's forming in my mind as an image around AUKUS, and it's for pillars 1 and 2, is that we're in something of a 5-legged race. It's coming up time and time again that we are all starting and coming at this from a really different position with really different capabilities. But I think what the report does really nicely is start to identify mechanisms that bring us, again, the word alignment, more closely into alignment, which will enable that catching up and that achievement of the collective outcome that we're all seeing. But I still feel again that we are operating at the moment as something of a 5-legged beast trying to run along and get to that finish line. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to go through to our first question here. We've got one from Robert Carrick, and his question is: in which industry groups or trade associations, or which industry groups and trade associations participate in this forum? Who is the Australian lead industry group? Now, I'm not sure which particular forum you're talking about there. Did you mean the study or?
Advanced Capabilities Industry Forum.
The Advanced Capabilities Industry Forum. Okay, so we are talking about that particular forum. Advanced Capabilities Industry Forum is the interface between governments and industrial bases via trade associations. Does anyone of you want to have a go at that one first? Perhaps maybe Roland, put you in the hot seat, or Gary? Roland, because it's really Australia focused.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer to the specific question. I can speak to the outreach we did on the report, and that was sort of direct into industry, so direct to companies and direct to offices.
I guess just building one, certainly, I'm not sure if it's the only one, but the Australian Industry Group has got a Defence Council executive, which is a primary forum that is interfacing between defence and certainly I'd characterise more tier 1, tier 2 industry partners.
Yep.
And if you're not a member, then that's a good place to start. And it's a very long-standing forum. I've been part of that for all 3 companies I've worked for outside of defence, and it does provide a really strong touch point and focal point, particularly around policy, skilling, commercial, the commercial challenges and realities that industry faces working effectively with defence.
Yeah. Matthew, do you have anything to add on this point? Because I think that the general question of the how of collaboration and the mechanism for enabling conversations between, in my view, the defence organisations in various countries, the companies large and small, and investors is probably a really key missing piece. I think that came out in the research as well. Any views from you on how that's is there a good or a best practice example of that? What do you think might work?
I think this is a rough observation, but I've noticed it when I'm in the United States. There seems to be a much broader willingness for USG to be involved in a variety of forums. I think the Australian government does communicate very well with industry, but I think it does so through the channels that it sort of typically chooses. I've noticed that USG tends to happily participate in a wide variety of forums, probably because there's just more of them. So more forums and more people. But I would, in terms of like other forums that is probably useful, I'd note there is the AUKUS forum, which is like an industry stood up forum, which is also regularly attended by Australian government. There's the AUKUS Defence Investor Network as well from the VC side of things. Chambers of Commerce have defence subcommittees, so AmCham has a very good defence subcommittee as well. I'm going to borrow the words of one of my good friends, Haley Channer at the United States Studies Centre, who says that innovation doesn't have an org chart. So I don't mind that there is like a layer cake of different forums and groupings, and the ASPI Joining Forces conference this week was another example about the different ways people can get together. So I wouldn't necessarily want to appoint a monopoly on defence industry engagement. I would say the more the better. Ideas and suggestions and feedback can come from a variety of places. So the more the better.
I think too, this will be a very long-standing enterprise. So we're sort of it was announced a while ago, but we're still at the beginning. So the fact that there's a flowering of groups around it, I think is actually very healthy.
I do too. I was going to make the same point, Roland. I think it's important that some of these fora self-generate to an extent, because sometimes we don't know who we need to talk to and how to involve all the people that we need to. But at some point we will probably see a consolidation or some are more useful or more connected either for industry or for government than others. So there will probably be a natural process where these sort of whittle down or consolidate a little going forward. But thank you for mentioning that variety. Another one that I just wanted to throw in there is the Australian British Chamber, which runs an AUKUS Catalyst each year as well. And I found that very, very useful. So different conversations happening in different fora led by different elements of the system are fascinating. And I'm trying to get along to as many as I can because I find it really rounds out the conversation and helps avoid that sort of single actor bias and again focus on that collective purpose that we do indeed all share. I'm going to go to the next question for you all now, which comes in from Afia Akand, and that is, what are the barriers and opportunities associated with the AUKUS partners cooperating with regional counterparts such as Japan and South Korea? Now, you've mentioned a collaboration that you did with Italy, for example. AUKUS Pillar 2 is not exclusive. It's not designed to be entirely exclusive. It does want to draw in a whole lot of opportunities and innovations and ways of doing business from other countries. Is there a risk that we are potentially getting in our own way with other partners from AUKUS Pillar 2?
So I don't think the risk is any different today under AUKUS Pillar 2 practices as it was yesterday without it. We've got, within my team, I am doing technology research and deployment of services into South Korea, into Japan, into Singapore, into New Zealand, from Australia, from the UK. And the same technology is also being used for AI and autonomy research and other applications which will fall under the AUKUS Pillar 2 banner. So I don't see that there are necessarily challenges and barriers and opportunities. There is technology and technology stewardship that needs to be managed.
Yep.
You get to a point very quickly, and it doesn't matter whether it's dealing with a US program or an Australian program or a UK program. As soon as you broach into classified technology and classified application, it's protected.
Yeah.
And you have to protect it, and you have to make sure that it is compartmentalized and that it is handled very carefully. AUKUS Pillar 2 regulation will improve the ability to exchange and transmit that information between Australia, the UK, and the United States, and we want to do more of that. But that doesn't negate the ability to apply the unclassified dimensions of those technologies into countries like Japan and South Korea, as we're doing today. But it means you've got to have a really professional, secure, disciplined approach to how you are capturing and using that technology.
Yeah.
And that's where Tier 2 and Tier 3 companies do tend to struggle, because they don't necessarily have and universities for that matter, they don't necessarily have that experience or that pedigree. And that's where companies like QinetiQ and other Tier 1 companies, I see, have got a really important responsibility to help, particularly our Australian ecosystem, to navigate through that so that they don't unintentionally make a mistake, because that can destroy trust and ability to do work.
Yep.
But it also they also may not have the capacity to do it themselves. And so how do we work in a more collaborative way to do that effectively?
Excellent.
But can I just add to that? I think there's there's two parts. I see New Zealand mentioned in one of the other comments as well. There's the formation period, which we're going through now, where you harmonise where you need to harmonise, you re-regulate where you need to re-regulate. And then there is the kind of operation of that grouping over time. I think in the formation period, there's always a danger if everyone's involved, you get nowhere fast. So it is. This is already right. This is already 3D chess, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to make it 4D. So through that formation period, I think like a tighter construct works. But with that tighter construct formed, I think for other parties, whether it's Japan, Korea, if you've cracked one, which is typically the US, then you've cracked three, firstly, which is better. And there is an ability to buy in certain areas, right? If you're prepared to harmonise in certain areas, you can buy in certain areas. Now, there's limits to that because a lot of these partners aren't part of Five Eyes, right? So there are limits in terms of information, security, and all the rest. But I think in the operating period, it actually makes things easier. Up front, we need to be careful that we're not so open that everything falls out.
Absolutely. Very important, because there's both opportunity and risk inherent in how we think about and go about and do this. Matthew, anything to add from your perspective on that one?
I'd say that AUKUS doesn't replace any other partnership that we may have. And so, countries like New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and many others, we have and will continue to maintain strong partners with those allies because they are crucial to the missions that we're looking to prove. And so I'd say it's important, to Roland's point, it's important that the inputs to AUKUS are harmonized around capability development, information sharing, but the outputs of AUKUS actually may create opportunities. I think some of those nations, I'm not picking on any particular, some of those nations have identified themselves as being fast followers of the US, and I think by consequence, fast followers of AUKUS. So to the extent that AUKUS can uplift and output capability, whether it's Australian, American, or UK, I think it actually opens up to those close allies to whom we already do have partnerships, opportunities for Australian, UK, and American businesses to share that capability more broadly.
I love that point, Matthew. Thank you, because I honestly, AUKUS Pillar 2 in particular, but Pillar 1 also in time should be a catalyst for stronger collaborations, both within our countries and with others. And I think a point that Defence has gone to great lengths to, really drive home within our national setting about AUKUS is, we're not suddenly taking stuff that we were doing with the UK in a bilateral sense or with the US and slapping an AUKUS banner on everything. It's not about that. AUKUS Pillar 2 is going after some quite specific outcomes. Of course, the benefits can flow over, and they should, organisationally, technologically, you name it, into a number of other things. But we don't automatically, not everything becomes about AUKUS, and not everything that comes from AUKUS stays within AUKUS. That's the point. We do have another question here. It's an interesting one. So this is from Natalie. None of us on this panel is from government, so let's answer this from the perspective that we can. Do we think government is prioritising resources across the nation where skills are directly transferable across sectors? So here we're getting after the adjacency question and how important adjacency might be to, I guess, realising particularly AUKUS Pillar 2. There's a question here about whether or not we should be engaging a bit more openly with the question of nuclear, particularly in the energy sector. But let's perhaps talk more to that sort of adjacency issue, and let's not keep that conversation or your answers national, because this is, in my view, one of the key trilateral issues and challenges of how do we get mobility of ideas and people without sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. How do we, we have a limited pool of money and talent. How are we thinking about managing this, or how can we? And I'm going to let one of you self-select to go first, because I'm going to feel really mean putting one of you on the spot.
I'll give it a go.
Good on you, Kel.
We obviously can't speak for government, but one of the really big pressures and challenges that we face as an industry, as an economy, is that competition for talent. And firstly, we need to grow more suitably qualified and experienced professionals and vocational. We're going to need a whole new generation of technicians and engineers and everyone around them. Not just in defence technology, and AUKUS Pillar 2 is all about technology disruption, but they're also going to be competing for, or we are competing against the decarbonisation and net zero industry arena, and then you've got the biomedical and all the other and a number of other adjacent industries, and we're all competing for the same talent. We've got a national and a tri-national need to really uplift the work, the number of people able to work in those industries, and that can be certainly more coordinated.
Yeah.
But the second element is then how do you attract them and keep them within, in our case, within the defence industry, and that's where I don't think we spend enough time talking about the purpose and the mission. There's very few things more impactful for a nation than its ability to remain a sovereign nation with independent action and authority.
Yes.
AUKUS are three countries of like mind, but we are three nations of individual identity, and we want to really celebrate that. I think we're in one of the best countries in the world, having lived and worked in a number of them. Mm-hmm. We've got to really motivate and connect the purpose of why you want to be involved in national security, so that we attract those people, and we should be celebrating that they can move from national security into net zero, into biomedical, because we want to enrich and enable our nation. And then what AUKUS Pillar 2 and some of the regulatory regimes provide is then it should be making it easier for mobility between Australia, the UK and the United States. And the more we can enrich and share and collaborate and build that inclusiveness, we build a much stronger ability to deliver and respond. It's not easy, otherwise we'd be doing it already. But I see that's a really fundamental challenge we've got.
Yep.
To put our arms around.
Yeah, agree.
Could I just add on the attraction of people into defence, and that competition issue? I think there is some mitigating factors, one of which actually comes through AUKUS Pillar 2. It gives us an opportunity to skill up areas of our workforce and obtain access to information and craft that we don't currently have access to. So that's helpful. But there is no doubt, actually I'll broaden this out. I think within and I'm not working in the defence sector now, within the defence sector, it is taken almost as read that it is an unalloyed good to participate in the defence of the country, whether it's in the ADF or in industry or whatever. And it's absolutely a view that I share. But we can't assume that it's shared everywhere, or even that it's understood or even thought about. And I think more thought needs to be given to almost I'll put it in investment language, the ESG case for working in defence or actually investing in defence as well. Not a defensive case, an affirmative case. Why is this actually a good thing that you should embrace? I think there is more work to do around that, because people get a lot of messages these days, and our message has to be very clear.
Most definitely. Matthew, you're actually a sort of a living, breathing micro example of what we're trying to do. I don't know how comfortable you are talking about the fact that you're working as a reservist, and I think without sort of putting words into either yours or the Chief of Army's mouth, is the intent behind a lot of what you're doing in uniform is to bring some of that awareness of the commercial sector into Army, and have Army learn a little bit more about that outside world, and I guess a little vice versa. Can I get you to reflect a little bit on not necessarily that particular initiative or example or how that's working, but on the broader question?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, in full disclosure, I'm a captain in the Australian Army Reserve, but my views here are my own and not the views of the ADF. I'm going to, and it's probably especially prescient to make that disclaimer, because I'm about to make a rogue suggestion, which is I think we should get used to deprecating the term defence industrial base. I think we should just refer to the industrial base. I think the report brings out the challenges of dual-use goods. And I would say that there are so many opportunities for the Australian industrial base to participate in defence. And I wouldn't see it as necessarily a competition for talent, but rather that we have so much talent in the broader industrial base that could be supporting defence.
Yeah.
And so to that end, I'd actually make a concrete suggestion, which one of the features of the US acquisition framework that I really admire is that they have a law which is a commercial item preference, which, we can go into the details about this, but the long story is around P-8 submarine, hunting planes and toilet seats. You can Google it, it's fascinating. But really, the law says that if there's a commercial item, defence or the government more broadly must acquire it. And that law doesn't exist in Australia. And I think that would encourage investment. It will encourage the commercial sector to look to defence as a place to make those investments in their products. It also cut down acquisition cost and time. And it's worked it's worked very well in the US. It was litigated by SpaceX and Palantir in the last few recent years. I think to raise the issue. I don't think it doesn't exist in Australia, or potentially should, but I think we should look to the industrial base more broadly. And I also think, to make another rogue suggestion, it's about the need for harmonisation and integration between defence and industry. There's a world in which I'd like to see listed Australian companies appoint chief resilience officers or chief defence officers, or those people that are potentially cleared and squarely placed to look at things like critical infrastructure, but also how to best support Australian industry and Australian government if they may have a defence application. So just make those current points around sort of thinking about those industries. I think we should broaden our perspective to think of the industrial base more broadly as a potential defence supplier.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, Roland, please.
I would applaud that suggestion and point out that if you broaden the aperture to the entire industrial base, there are parts of the Australian industrial base. We talk about the problem of costs and scale and all the rest of it. There are parts of our industrial base that are at the absolute bottom of the global cost curve in what they do, that handle all sorts of technologies that are interesting and potentially applicable, and do not need defence at all. So it is in terms of who might need who and what needs to be done to attract them, they do not need to push into the defence sector at all. And to the extent that we can harness them, they need to be enticed.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. All I was going to say, Matthew, was I think neither of those was a rogue suggestion. I think we're all very receptive, and government itself is probably very receptive to those as well. And those points on ESG, the affirmative case for defence and security and resilience, and starting to talk about this more broadly and broadening that definition of the industrial base upon which defence can draw, but doesn't necessarily need to be defined as defence. It's really important. We're getting really short on time, but an issue that came up a lot in the report, so I do want to give each of you a chance to talk to it from your various perspectives, is IP. There are a lot of perceptions around the challenges for IP, sharing IP, exposing innovative edges, and how companies are being asked to share information where they're feeling a little vulnerable. What are some solutions that might help collaboration that sort of have that IP sort of protection, both for companies and for national benefit at their heart? Does anyone want to lead off on that one as our final question?
Okay. So I'll approach from two directions. Firstly, and this was raised in the ASPI conference earlier in the week, we've got to change the conversation of IP from transactional ownership to value.
Yes.
And defence and tier one companies historically like to own everything.
Yeah.
Whereas what we want to do is engage with tier two, tier three companies, invest in them creating their value and for them to be able to commercialise and exploit their IP through and alongside those tier one companies for defence. So I think that would be a really great piece of work to understand how we change that focus more to value and investment as opposed to ownership. And then the second one is you might have the best IP and solution, but if it doesn't connect to what mission or challenge that defence is trying to solve, it will not get through.
Yep.
So we've seen from working inside the wire alongside Defence Science and Technology Group here in Australia that it's really that physical security and physical barrier makes it really difficult to introduce that innovative and disruptive IP. It's one of the reasons we created our Technology Engineering Centre literally around the corner from Defence Science and Technology Group in Melbourne at Fisherman's Bend.
Yeah.
It's secure, but it provides a commercial access point for companies and innovators to come in, have an introduction, have their ideas evaluated and tested, because it has to work in the customer's environment, not in a lab or on a simulation. And the more that we can facilitate and create those points of connection where companies and individuals can bring their ideas in, show that they work and make a difference, that makes it real for the end user and for the warfighter, and it accelerates the ability to adopt those technologies over time.
That's such a great example of the kind of thing, mechanistically that's needed, but also of the role the tier ones can and should play. So thank you for that one. Roland and Matthew, any responses on that?
Yeah, if you look at AUKUS's structure, there's 3 buyers, and so you can't have one of them owning the IP if you unless you expect them to act as a reseller to the other 2.
Yeah.
So I'm all in favour of contractor ownership of IP and building vertically integrated systems. But I then think it's incumbent on government to say, well, we then want modular solutions and microservices architectures where things can be easily put in and replaced. That requires defence to maybe set standards around APIs and information sharing and things like that. So we get into the weeds on this, but that's my view briefly.
I'd add back. I mean, Matthew mentioned before the need to attract risk capital. So any IP arrangements between large and small players or that involve government needs to have regard to this. What will this arrangement do to the investment case for that particular technology proponent? How will it impact their ability to raise capital? How will it impact their ability to thrive and to supply into the AUKUS opportunity? Right. So that commercial consideration needs to be at the forefront from the beginning.
Well, look, this seems like a terrific place to end. Pretty close to on time. I would like to encourage all in the audience to Google or to search the ASPI strategy site for pieces. Roland Stevens himself did a tripart series for us before we even began this project. We've been talking about these issues for a while. George Hennicky, the 2 authors, both are ASPI senior fellows and will continue to work with and write for us. We're really, really keen to represent a lot of opinions and a diversity of perspectives on the strategist. So the other thing to do is to have a look on our strategist website about how you yourself might be published as an author and get your ideas out there for debate, for uplift, for really moving this conversation along. We've moved to a pitch-based model, and we have some fabulous editors who can help you get your ideas out of your head onto a page and share them with the world. So the more we talk about this, the more we hear from you all, I think the better shape that we'll all be in. Thanks so much. Again, a wonderful report. I'm immensely proud of the contribution that this makes. So thank you, Roland. Thank you, George and Abstentia. Thank you to Raython and Lidos for their contributions as well. And to both of you today for becoming part of this really important conversation as we take it forward, Matthew and Gary. Thanks so much. And the audience, thank you for joining us. Please stay engaged. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.